treats serious subjects flippantly," said Elton. "Her attitude towards life is to prepare a pancake as if it were a souffle." "That proves the Celt in me," cried Lady Tanagra. "If I were English I should make a souffle as if it were a pancake." Mr. Triggs looked from one to the other in obvious bewilderment. "I am perfectly serious in my question," said Lady Tanagra, without the vestige of a smile. "Mr. Triggs is elemental." "To be elemental is to be either indelicate or overbearing," murmured Elton, "and Mr. Triggs is neither." "Love, me dear?" said Mr. Triggs, not in the least understanding the trend of the conversation. "I don't think I've got any ideas about it." "Surely you're not a cynic, Mr. Triggs?" demanded Lady Tanagra. "A what?" enquired Mr. Triggs. "Surely you believe in love?" said Lady Tanagra. "Me and Mrs. Triggs lived together happily for over 30 years," he replied gravely, "and when a man and woman have lived together for all that time they get to believe in love. It's never been the same since she died." His voice became a little husky, and Elton looked at Lady Tanagra, who lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Triggs. Will you tell us about She broke off. "Well, you see, me dear," said Mr. Triggs in an uncertain voice, "I was a foreman when I met her, and she was a servant, but somehow or other it seemed that we were just made for each other. Once I knew her, I didn't seem to be able to see things without her. When I was at work, I was in the building trade, foreman, carpenter," he explained, "I used to be thinking of her all the time. If I went anywhere without her, she only had one night off a week and one day a month, I would always keep thinking of how she would like what I was seeing or eating. It was a funny feeling," he added reminiscently, as if entirely unable to explain it. "Somehow or other I always wanted to have her with me, so that she might share what I was having. It was a funny feeling," he repeated, and he looked from one to another with moist eyes. "Of course," he added, "I can't explain things like that. I'm not clever." "I think, Mr. Triggs, that you've explained love in Lady Tanagra broke off and looked at Elton, who was unusually grave. "Mr. Triggs has explained it," he replied, "in the only way in which it can be explained, and that is by being defined as unexplainable." Mr. Triggs looked at Elton for a moment, then nodded his head violently. "That's it, Mr. Elton, that's it. It's a feeling, not a thing that you can put into words." Lady Tanagra looked at Patricia, who was apparently engrossed in the waving tops of the trees. "I shall always remember your definition of love, Mr. Triggs," said Lady Tanagra with a faraway look in her eyes. "I think you and Mrs. Triggs must have been very happy together." "'Appy, me dear, that wasn't the word for it," said Mr. Triggs. "And when she was taken, I He broke off huskily and blew his nose vigorously. "Suppose you were very poor, Mr. Triggs," began Patricia. "I was when I married," interrupted Mr. Triggs. "Suppose you were very poor," continued Patricia, "and you loved someone very rich. What would you do?" "God bless my soul, I never thought of that. You see, Emily 'adn't anything. She only got £16 a year." Lady Tanagra turned her head aside and blinked her eyes furiously. "But suppose, Mr. Triggs," persisted Patricia, "suppose you loved someone who was very rich and you were very poor, what would you do? Would you tell them?" For a moment Patricia allowed her eyes to glance in the direction of Elton, and saw that his gaze was fixed upon Mr. Triggs. "But what has money got to do with it?" demanded Mr. Triggs, a puzzled expression on his face. "Exactly," said Patricia. "That's what I wanted to know." "Money sometimes has quite a lot to do with life," remarked Elton to no one in particular. "With life, Mr. Elton," said Mr. Triggs, "but not with love." "You're an idealist," said Lady Tanagra. "Am I?" said Mr. Triggs with a smile. "And he is also a dear," said Patricia. Mr. Triggs looked at her and smiled. Lady Tanagra and Elton drove off, Patricia saying that she wanted to walk. Mr. Triggs also declined Lady Tanagra's offer of a lift. "She wanted me to bring her with me," announced Mr. Triggs as they strolled along by the Serpentine. "Who did?" enquired Patricia. "'Ettie. ran up to change your things and sent out for a taxi." "And what did you say?" enquired Patricia. "I didn't say anything. But when the taxi come, I just slipped in and came along here. Fancy 'Ettie and Lady Tanagra," said Mr. Triggs. "No," he added a moment later. "It's no good trying to be what you ain't. If 'Ettie was to remember she's a builder's daughter, and not think she's a great lady, she'd be much 'appier," said Mr. Triggs, with unconscious wisdom. "Suppose I was to try and be like Mr. Elton," continued Mr. Triggs. "I'd look like a fool." "We all love to have you just as you are, Mr. Triggs, and we won't allow you to change," said Patricia. Mr. Triggs smiled happily. He was as susceptible to flattery as a young girl. "Well, it ain't much good trying to be what you're not. I've been a working man, and I'm not ashamed of it, and you and Lady Tanagra and Mr. Elton ain't ashamed of being seen with me. But 'Ettie, she'd no more be seen with her old father in Hyde Park than she'd be seen with him in a Turkish bath." "We all have our weaknesses, don't you think?" said Patricia, and Mr. Triggs agreed. "You, for instance, have a weakness for high society," continued Patricia. "Me, me dear?" exclaimed Mr. Triggs in surprise. "Yes," said Patricia, "it's no good denying it. Don't you like knowing Lord Peter and Lady Tanagra, Mr. Elton and all the rest of them?" "It's not because they're in society," began Mr. Triggs. "Oh yes, it is. You imagine that you're now a very great personage. Soon you will be moving from Streatham into Park Lane, and then you will not know me." "Oh, me dear," said Mr. Triggs in distress. "It's no good denying it," continued Patricia. "Look at the way you made friends with Lord Peter." Patricia was priding herself on the way in which she had led the conversation round to Bowen, but Mr. Triggs was not to be drawn. "God bless my soul," he cried, stopping still and removing his hat, mopping his brow vigorously. "I don't mind whether anyone has a title or not. It's just them I like. Now look at Lady Tanagra. No one would think she was a lady." "Really, Mr. Triggs, I shall tell her if you take her character away in this manner. She's one of the most exquisitely bred people I have ever met." Mr. Triggs looked reproachfully at Patricia. "It's a bit 'ard on a young gal when she finds her father drops his H's," he remarked, reverting to his daughter. "I often wonder whether I was right in giving Hetty such an education. She went to an 'igh school at Eastmouth," he added. "It only made her dissatisfied. It was 'ard luck her having me for her father," he concluded more to himself than to Patricia. "I am perfectly willing to adopt you as a father, Mr. Triggs, if you are in want of adoption," said Patricia. Mr. Triggs turned to her with a sunny smile. "Ah, you're different, me dear. You see, you're a lady born, same as Lady Tanagra, but 'Ettie ain't. That's what makes her sensitive like. It's a funny world," Mr. Triggs continued. "If you go about with one boot, and you happen to be a duke, people make a fuss of you because you're a character. But if you happen to be a builder, and go about in the same way, they call you mad." That evening Patricia was particularly unresponsive to Mr. Bolton's attempts to engage her in conversation. Chapter 15